In September of 2018, someone, and considering only 2 people were supposed to have access to it, you can take a guess of who it might have been, just, random 50-50 shot in the dark, leaked a confidential letter written by Dr. Christine Blasey Ford, professor of psychology at the University of Palo Alto, sent to the office of Senator Dianne Feinstein, in which Dr. Ford accused the Honorable Judge Brett Kavanaugh of sexually assaulting her when they were both in high school. Despite knowing about the letter's existence for some time, somehow it ended up getting published right before the elevation of Judge Kavanaugh to the highest court in the United States. Thus began a media and political circus, which would culminate in Democrat senators debating the meaning of fart jokes, going through a 17-year-old boy's journal and personal calendar, and assessing whether or not it's okay to drink beer.
Did it relate to alcohol?
I like
You
beer.
haven't answered that.
I like beer. I don't know if you do.
Okay.
Do you like beer, Senator, or not? What do you like to drink?
Next one is
Senator, what do you like to drink?
In what really was, well, you know what? You explain it for me, Senator Graham.
This is the most unethical sham since I've been in politics. If you vote no, you're legitimizing the most despicable thing I have seen in my time in politics. You want this seat? I hope you never get it. I hope you're on the Supreme Court. That's exactly where you should be. And I hope that the American people will see through this charade.
Thanks, and congratulations on growing a set, you old saber rattler. Regardless of your personal opinion on the validity of Dr. Ford's claims, it is assuredly so that this hearing and the outrage surrounding it will have an immeasurable impact on American politics and culture, likely for years to come. Not only in the now probably undeniable election of Judge Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court itself, but all of the baggage that will come with it, including the fact that this new justice might have just a slightly biased leaning in regards to the Democrat Party, considering they spent weeks painting him as a gang rapist without a shred of physical evidence, including also the Me Too movement, which is already struggling to maintain any semblance of credibility after hashtag trender Asia Argento was herself accused of being a sexual predator, including the entire ubiquity of feminism and the anti-family Marxist ideology within our society, taking probably a major blow with the revelation likely to many previously well-meaning but uninformed or simply uninterested parties now being given a beaming example on the national stage, overshadowing all of the many previous cases before it, such as the Rolling Stone debacle or Mattress Girl, of the extremity of the reach and power of a woman's mere words. But most interesting to me is the effect of this upon how the general public perceives the accuracy of human memory. Because if the mainstream media and leftist politicians had their way, this perception of memory as infallible will fly in the face of 100 years of psychological and sociological research. And that, dear friends, I cannot abide. So it's what we'll be looking at today: human memory and trauma. Over the course of the hearing, Dr. Ford repeatedly states that she remembers little to no details regarding her assault beyond a general description of the interior of the house in which it occurred, although she has no recollection of how she got there or how she got home afterwards, nor does she know whose home it was. She states that 2 men groped her, and that one was unquestionably Brett Kavanaugh. But something that interested me is that she says she recalls with clarity the laughter, which she states is indelible to the hippocampus.
Indelible in the hippocampus is the laughter, the uproarious laughter between the two.
I'm not exactly sure what you mean there, but we'll get into it. At several points, Dr. Ford engaged in similar use of neurobiological and psychological jargon, including stating that she was confident in the validity of her recollections as being as accurate as her current ongoing perception because of norepinephrine?
How are you so sure that it was he?
The same way that I'm sure that I'm talking to you right now. It's just basic memory functions, and also just the level of norepinephrine and epinephrine in the brain that sort of, as you know, encodes, that neurotransmitter encodes memories into the hippocampus and So the trauma-related experience then is kind of locked there, whereas other details kind of drift.
Hang on a second. Much like the former, that's a statement that actually makes little sense, but it sounds scientific and thereby credible to the average Joe just listening in. And by the way, I should mention Dr. Ford appears to be quite credible in her field from what I can tell. I took a glance through this textbook that she co-authored and was pleasantly surprised to find it to be a succinct, clear, and concise resource for quantitative methodology. So much so that I bought a copy of it, seriously, to use as a resource. That is, we have evidence that indicates Dr. Ford does know what she's talking about when it comes to statistics and other areas of her research emphasis, which is psychopharmacology and the treatment of mental health disorders. That means that she knows better than most to say something like laughter is stored in the hippocampus, although maybe that was just a misstep, but thereby more heinously, in my opinion, for her to present it as accurate, that her current perceptions are as clear and accurate as 35-year-old recollections, particularly when those recollections are regarding a psychologically traumatic event. That's just simply not correct. It does not line up with the extant research. Taking a quick look at her curriculum vitae, we can see that Dr. Ford has published on the subject of anxiety, depression, and the treatment of veterans, which makes me even more puzzled when I consider her statements and, subsequently, causes me to call into question her motives. But before you rush to the comments to say I'm being unfair to Dr. Ford, because I'm not listening and believing, that's the thing. I'm listening very closely, and I'm actually somewhat prone to believe that at some time in her youth, yes, Dr. Ford may have experienced a sexual assault. That's not what I have an issue with. What I find insulting is when I see a scientist saying something that they should know better than to say, or something that doesn't make any sense and is essentially being used as psychobabble. And thus, I take umbrage with her description of how memory works, and the way that the media and Democrats alike have portrayed her recollection as both simultaneously ironclad, that she can have these flashbulb memories, while at the same time excusing the massive gaps in the exact same memory, all as being scientifically supported because a psychologist came out and used some big words to describe it. Why do I find that insulting? Because I have a very good reason to believe that Dr. Ford is herself more than a little bit familiar with the subject to make grievous errors in describing what she's talking about, and as such, did maybe lie about that at least, and considering no amount of FBI investigation into a nearing 4-decade-old allegation without a single accessible detail will show she intentionally is lying about anything else in this case, this is something I can point to as being, if not inaccurate, then being misrepresented, and therefore needs to be addressed. Dr. Ford describes herself as having PTSD or PTSD-like symptoms as a result of the assault, including claustrophobia and social anxiety, causing her to install 2 front doors into her home and to develop a fear of flying, although she apparently rents out said home to strangers and seems to fly rather frequently. But inconsistencies aside, let's take a look at how PTSD and traumatic memories function within the brain, to find out if laughter really is stored in the hippocampus. When we are exposed to dangerous events or experiences, our brain activates its natural defense mechanism, the fight, flight, freeze response. This occurs in the amygdala. In reaction to this fearful event, the brain releases stress-related catecholamines, such as epinephrine and norepinephrine. Typically, after a stressful event, the brain then eventually returns to its normal functioning. But in cases of extreme trauma, the memories of said trauma are often misprocessed, causing the same fight-flight response to be activated in reaction to actually no present or extant danger. This is because traumatic memories are unique due to the state of the mind during their encoding. In his overview of the data, Cahill in 1997 notes that research has found the injection of one stress hormone, in particular epinephrine, affects learning, with very low levels actually enhancing memory, but high doses impeding learning and processing of memories. Specifically, Cahill and his colleagues' research was concerned with the kind of isolated, vivid memory described by Dr. Ford, the kind of flashbulb memory, where she can recall things such as music being played or the way that she felt, but can't recall anything else, like how she got there or how she left. and the researchers found that retention was lower when recalling a neutral film or story that was shown to participants rather than an emotionally charged story, but that this increase in recall of the more emotional events was diminished in patients who were given beta blockers that mitigated physical stress responses. In other words, it seems that being a little bit more emotional or more stressed may potentially lead to greater recall. This finding, however, was not present in a patient with a lesion on the bilateral amygdala. The amygdaloid complex is important because, again, it's the part of the brain that's responsible for the acquisition of fear response to stimuli. So it's true, we may be actually more likely to recall some intense emotional memories when they concern something like a sad story. But when our brains are hyperactivated, releasing lots of, for example, epinephrine, we may be considerably less likely to process those memories and encode them correctly. Those kinds of events, they overstimulate the amygdala. And when the amygdala is overstimulated, it has a long-term effect on the hippocampus, the region which is, in fact, associated with long-term memory processing. And just as with someone who has a lesion of the amygdala is less affected by this emotional response because they're less likely to adapt to it, damage to the hippocampus has considerable impact on the recollection of memories. In other words, with very emotional, frightening memories in particular, the more activated the amygdala becomes in association with that memory. Ruminating about it, thinking about it often, causes a reintroduction then of the same stress hormones that were caused and initiated by the event itself. And ultimately, over a prolonged period of rumination, of thinking back onto the traumatic experience, leads to problems within the hippocampus and elsewhere in the brain, due to an overactivation of the amygdala and inundation of various different brain chemicals, which may ultimately cause problems with memory processing in general, but potentially, and more importantly, causes problems with the specific traumatic memory being less accurately recalled. It's being thought about a lot, but it's not being processed and integrated correctly. While the amygdala itself is hyperaroused and the brain is being inundated with these catecholamines, glucocorticoids, several changes begin to occur. As this arousal period is prolonged, the body becomes less capable of producing the same amounts of hormones. It simply becomes too stressed out to continue to operate at such a high stress function, which results actually in atrophy of the hippocampus, including cell death. That means that the memory center of your brain physically withers in size under the continual strain and hypocortisolism that is forwarded from an overactivation of the amygdala in response to a stressing event. For review, see Yehuda 2003 on cortisol on the hippocampus. The result is that the traumatic memory that originally caused the stress response is often not processed and stored accurately given the damage that is caused to the hippocampus. This atrophy affects not only long-term memory, but also short-term memory and reasoning. What this means is that the amygdaloid complex, which does not suffer from the same deleterious effects faced by the hippocampus, continues to process and react to sensory perceptions. But then in response, the long-term memory, which helps inform us of how to react to dangerous situations based on our lived experiences, becomes damaged and incapable of often providing accurate recollections. This results in a kind of feedback loop of inappropriate reactions based on inaccurate memories. These changes are felt throughout our neurobiology. As Zhang et al. 2016 recently found through fMRI analysis, people suffering from the disorder I've described above present with changes in the function of their thalamus as well, which is the region concerned with sensory input, and the prefrontal cortex, which has been related to memory processing, and the insula, which is connected to emotional and cognitive processing. These various malfunctions, both in brain chemistry and ultimately physical changes to our neurobiology, are the characteristics of post-traumatic stress disorder, as it presents in the dysregulation of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. PTSD, again, being something that Dr. Ford claims to suffer from, as do many people suffer from who are the victims of sexual assault. Of course, common media portrayals of PTSD depict the kind of flashbulb illuminative memories in a similar nature to what Dr. Ford describes in her account. She can't remember when, where, who, or how, but she can remember the exact event in precise detail, at least a few details. We commonly see the trope that the sound of fireworks on the 4th of July take the veteran right back into the rice paddies of Viet fucking Nam, where he is forced to relive the game of Russian roulette as clearly as if he was still there physically. Except that's not really how this functions. The traumatic memory that is triggered, and I'm using that term accurately here, is itself often not very accurate, for the reasons that I described above. And people who suffer from this disorder are reacting to an overactive amygdala and underactive hippocampus. The memory is very real. The experiencing of the trauma definitely happened. But in terms of the details of the event, as realistic as they might seem during the flashbulb remembrance, that memory exists kind of outside of the general long-term memory. It hasn't been processed correctly. It hasn't been integrated. That's precisely why we have the trope of the veteran reacting to the fireworks and believing it to be a bombardment.
Sending your chick a Valentine, huh?
Yeah.
Johnny! Johnny! Johnny!
Cool, I broke his brain.
Of course, we know that these are not the same thing, but the sensory perception is the part that's reacting to the fragments of this memory, rather than the hippocampus, the section that would generally be processing these long-term recollections. And as such, this misprocessing, this reaction to events that don't necessarily represent the traumatic event, leads to the overstimulation of the amygdala and thereby problems across the mental landscape. For more information, see Trumbull 2006 for an overview of the neurobiology of post-traumatic stress disorder. But today, we're specifically interested in how PTSD affects memory. In a review of the literature, Bruin 2001 similarly notes that people who suffer from PTSD do have these vivid flashbacks involving intense sensory perceptions, which can be recalled through verbally accessible memory, or VAM, and through situationally accessible memory, or SAM. This separation of the general memory processing types allows those who do suffer from this disorder to be capable of describing the traumatic event while also being subject potentially to situational triggers that elicit that flashbulb effect that put people into a state of panic, hyperactivate the amygdala, and cause atrophy to the hippocampus and long-term memory. I bring this up because it's how someone like Dr. Ford could stand in front of the Senate and describe her assault in incredible detail, or at least to the best detail that she remembers, without shedding a tear. To many people, that came off as disingenuous. However, that could also just be a manifestation of the verbally accessible memory. What remains consistent either way is the neurobiology, in that while describing the event, it may seem that the memory is being recalled with perfect clarity by an individual. That said, memory is more likely to be damaged, misprocessed, or generally unintegrated than other memories, or memories of people who have not suffered from such a traumatic event. And thus, said memory is highly subject to error, more so than a memory within anyone else. But I do bring that up because the separation of the verbal and situational memory illustrates how even under stressful conditions, one may still be fully capable of describing their traumatic memory in detail, even if those details are inaccurate. All of this is potentially of particular concern for women who suffer from PTSD as a result of sexual abuse. They are a unique group. Bremner et al. 2003a found that those women had significantly decreased hippocampal volume compared to women who suffered from PTSD originating from a source outside of abuse, typically car crashes. Additionally, these data further provide support for the idea that PTSD subjects with decreased hippocampal volume struggle to properly encode memories. Women who suffered from PTSD were significantly less capable of encoding new memories. Unsurprisingly, an extensive amount of research has also concerned women who suffer from PTSD as a result of sexual abuse during childhood or adolescence. The other Bremner study, Bremner et al. 2003b, and his colleagues found issues in memory dysfunction in female PTSD patients who had been sexually abused in their youth. Specifically, results forwarded a decrease in blood flow in the orbitofrontal cortex, anterior cingulate, and medial prefrontal cortex, left hippocampus, fusiform, and inferior temporal gyrus. with, in contrast, increased blood flow in the posterior cingulate, left inferior parietal cortex, left middle frontal gyrus, and visual association and motor cortex. What that all means is that there was a loss of activation in the more cognitive and memory-oriented areas of the brain, while there was an increase in activation of the more sensory-oriented areas in women who suffered from PTSD as a result of adolescent sexual abuse. Further, a review of pediatric PTSD from Kavanaugh 2008 reports similar to the above that children or adolescents who are abused suffer from the same repercussions as adult sufferers of PTSD, with overproduction of noradrenaline and catecholamines, reduced hippocampal volume and increased amygdaloid complex activity, and a trend of eventual decreased cortisol as a result. The researchers suggest that the increased hormonal production of noradrenaline and catecholamines such as norepinephrine can be projected on an increasingly diverging scale, meaning that these effects compound over time. As norepinephrine and noradrenaline go up, cortisol production goes down. Thus, we can surmise that the earlier the age at which the event occurs, the more severe the long-term impacts on the brain. This topic particularly concerned Koss et al. 1996, who developed a model of memory in women who had experienced sexual assault or rape, and found that in general, rape victims expressed lower clarity, re-experiencing, and non-visual sensory memories than women who had not been raped when recalling a past event. This is cogent with the aforementioned research on the effects on PTSD on memory processing. Further, while rape victims reported lower clarity in the description of the event compared to more positive memories, this was partially mediated through the perceptions of the self as a victim of rape. What that means is that while memory of rape was negatively correlated to clarity of recall at the level of a negative 0.61, a rather strong correlation, when the victim perceived herself as a victim, that reached a positive correlation with memory clarity of 0.14, a weak but still significant correlation. The point is, however, that generally speaking, rape victims, particularly female rape victims or victims of sexual assault, are likely to have highly inaccurate memories, although typically very emotional and intense ones, in regards to the crime that was committed against them. For a greater overview of sexual assault and PTSD on both the biological and sociological impacts on women, see Chivers-Wilson 2006. Hopefully by now I have laid out a relatively comprehensive explanation as to how Dr. Ford could have been sexually abused as an adolescent, developed PTSD or PTSD-like symptoms that thereby caused long-term dysfunction in the HPA axis, which affected both long and short-term memory, the latter of which she does seem to suffer from lapses in as well, but would leave her with highly emotional, flashbulb recollections of an event that likely did occur. However, that memory as it exists is existing within a malfunctioning hippocampus is likely highly unclear and subject not so much to accuracy of recall, but to potentially very tertiarily related sensory inputs. I am painting for you, my friends, a very logical escape for Dr. Ford from potentially having perjured herself. However, that may be a bit late, given, as I said, I think that she knows all of this already. But let's continue to assume, unlike most of Kavanaugh's detractors, the innocence of Dr. Ford in her accusation. Why, after 36 years, would she come forward with this claim? Well, if she was the victim of sexual assault and suffers from typical traumatic neurobiological issues, I may have an answer for that which extends beyond the political motivations of the likes of leaking Dianne Feinstein. Porter and Burt 2001 examined the topics of recall regarding traumatic memories and the concepts of recovered memories. As we might expect, traumatic memories were reported as being highly detailed, more so than were pleasant ones, but otherwise were similar in all other assessed qualities to positive memories. This presented in a curvilinear fashion regarding detail, however, with the most severe trauma being regarded as less detailed. They did find that memories of sexual assault were more vivid than other traumatic memories, but again, we need to consider that vividness is being affected by the thalamus and the amygdala, two sections that we see are either overactivated or disconnected in people who suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of abuse or sexual assault. Therefore, a memory may be extremely vivid, but that vividness is not necessarily related to its empirical accuracy. Let's look further then into the topic of recovered memories that are either forgotten or repressed, often for years. Of Porter and Britt's 306 participants, only 14 reported forgetting a memory for a period of time, and of those who reported forgetting, 11 participants said they consciously attempted to forget the event. Of the 3 participants who reported unintentionally forgetting, 2 said that they were reminded of it randomly, and a third said they were reminded through a conversation with another person. What prompts the recovery of forgotten or relapsed memories? We can look to Elliott 1997 for some potential answers, and while a bit dated given our modern media environment, it's still of potential import. 505 participants were asked about their experiences with one of 13 different types of traumatic events, including witnessing a murder, a suicide of a relative, combat, or surviving sexual abuse. Of those who reported experiencing such a trauma, 32%, so a far larger number than the findings of Porter and Burt, reported delayed recall of the event, with 17% reporting temporary delay recall and another 15% reporting total loss of memory. Both partial and complete memory loss were typified by specific types of trauma over others. Specifically, child abuse of any form was more likely to be related to memory loss or delayed recall. While adult rape also comprised 13% of all reports of total memory loss, Elliott found that the characteristics most associated with memory loss were the age at which the trauma occurred, as well as the number of traumatic incidences incurred by a single person, and most strongly, with the level of distress of the memory incurred. Of those who had recovered a partially or completely lost memory, comprising 115 people in the sample, the most common cue that triggered recollection was media presentation, with 47% of the sample saying that media exposure caused them to recover a memory, followed by talking with a family member or experiencing a similar event, both at the level of 32%, talking with a non-family member, being involved with a violent experience, having a nightmare, and engaging with reminiscent sensory inputs were all also potentially triggering of memories between 15 and 24% of cases, with multiple cues often leading to a recall, hence the numbers already leading to above 100%. Interestingly though, talking to a psychiatrist or undergoing psychotherapy was related to remembrance of lost memories at the lowest percentage, at only 12% of these cases. What we can extract from these data then is that seeing a media representation that reminds one of a traumatic event or memory which has been repressed is the most common cue for eliciting restored recollection. And what has happened over the last few months? Well, Brett Kavanaugh was placed on a short list of nominees for the Supreme Court, and his face was plastered across media outlets, both nationally and even internationally. This means it is very likely that other issues or memories possessed by Dr. Ford may have been primed and cued by the ubiquity of Kavanaugh's visage. There is rather significant support to show how the mere viewing of someone's face can make one more likely to perceive them of guilty of a crime when questioned. For example, Deffenbacher, Borstein, and Penrod 2006 examined 25 years of research and 3 meta-analyses on the exposure of individuals to mugshots on accuracy in identification of a criminal, and found that seeing someone's face has a consistent and considerable negative effect on the accuracy of a witness's ability to identify the perpetrator of a crime, with a mean effect, again across 3 assessed meta-analyses containing nearly 600 individual studies of negative 0.28, and conversely with a false alarm misreporting of a criminal being associated positively with being shown a mugshot at the level of 0.48. What that means is that seeing someone's face before being asked to identify a criminal resulted in them being less likely to accurately or correctly identify the actual perpetrator of a crime, and be far more likely to false report the person that they were exposed to as guilty regardless of any empirical evidence. When Brett Kavanaugh's mug is being displayed on every newspaper, television screen, and smartphone app, is it possible, if not even probable then, that when asked to recall the man who assaulted her 36 years ago, Dr. Ford may have been more than slightly prone to falsely believe him to be her assaulter, particularly given her recent involvement in psychotherapy? Remember before I get into this that I said psychotherapy was listed as the least common reason for recalling a lost memory, but that doesn't mean we should ignore it as a potential influencing factor. There have been, after all, numerous highly public instances of abuse, of clinical transference, or even intentional memory implantation from clinicians that has caught the attention of the public over the last few decades, and has recently drawn some similar quizzical posturing from many regarding the case of Dr. Ford, saying that she had totally forgotten about the assault until she spoke about it with both her therapist and her husband in relationship counseling. As I mentioned, speaking of her husband, talking about a traumatic event with a family member was tied with experiencing a similar trauma for the most common reason of recalling a forgotten experience. But therapists, counselors, and social workers certainly can and have had a role in inventing, implanting, or influencing false memories. In the 1980s, the McMartin preschool trial, in which multiple people were incriminated in everything from child abuse to rape to worshiping Satan, made international headlines. While it is a long tale deserving of plenty of individual attention, and which you can read plenty about in the book We Believe the Children, A Moral Panic in the 1980s, linked below, the long story short of the McMartin preschool case is that social worker Key McFarlane, who interviewed 400 children from the area, was found to have significantly influenced the reported memories of children regarding sexual abuse through suggestion and through repetition. McFarlane would often press the children over and over again to report that they had been abused or raped. When they answered without accusatory statements towards their caretakers, she would question the validity of their own memories until she obtained a response that she could reasonably describe as abusive. Much like the infamous Salem witch trials, the absurd falsities of the McMartin preschool, media, and judicial circus illustrated to many Americans the incredible influential power of psychologists and people of sociological or therapeutic positions upon their patients. A landmark case rewarded Gary Ramona $500,000 in legal damages in 1994 in his lawsuit versus his daughter's therapist for implanting false memories of sexual abuse, sparking not only, again, national outrage, but a wealth of research on the topic in the mid-90s of the potential for therapists and mental health practitioners to facilitate the creation of new memories in their patients based on a form of malpractice, often manifesting as countertransference. What is transference? It's a concept that originates from the Freudian field of psychotherapy, in which Freud noted a tendency for patients to project their own emotions and memories onto the therapist. And in reverse, we have countertransference, which is the therapist projecting his or her own issues and hang-ups onto the patient. Given the often highly interpersonal nature of the relationship between patient and therapist, particularly in psychotherapy or psychodynamic therapy rather than more cognitive or behavioral methods of treatment, it's not only logical that this bidirectional transference of emotions can occur, but expected. However, a danger arises in that in countertransference, a therapist may inadvertently influence the patient's own memories. This can be achieved with actual relative ease, or often again on accident, through repeated suggestion or exposure to a topic or suggestion. It can also occur through a therapist simply making an error in misremembering him or herself a recording of an event that the patient told about his history. Zaragoza and Mitchell, 1996, showed undergraduate participants a series of questions in a short video, and then either 48 hours or a week later, asked them to report yes or no, whether an item on that list of questions, or in the video, had actually occurred. A yes response, however, in this case was always a false positive, an implanted memory of something that had not actually been present in the stimulus. These participants saw the questions or video once, twice, or 3 times, and the results indicated that the more times participants were exposed to the stimuli, the more likely they were to give a false positive of perceiving something to have happened that did not. A second experiment in this study further forwarded that participants who were exposed to more instances of the stimuli were not only more likely to give a false positive, but were also more likely to report being more assured that their responses and their memories were real. In other words, mere exposure to a concept makes us potentially less likely to answer valid questions about that concept with accuracy and clarity. We think we know better, but in fact, we often know less. Much like what we learned about mugshots, simply repeating suggestions can thereby implant a memory of which we feel very sure, but which is in reality completely fabricated. Have you ever had a friend take a story that happened to you, that you told them, and then in turn tell it to other friends as if it had happened to them? If you've told that story enough, it's possible your friend isn't just trying to ape your storytelling skills, but rather, based on repeated exposure, may he or herself actually misremember that event as having happened to him or her.
I was hunted once. I just came back from Nam. I was hitching through Oregon, and some cops started harassing me. Next thing you know, I had a whole army of cops chasing me through the woods. I had to take them all out. It was a bloodbath.
That's Rambo, dude.
What?
You just described the plot of Rambo.
Yeah, that's the first from
It's
the first
the
one.
first blood. Yeah, I think you're
First
confusing
Blood.
your life with Rambo, bro.
That's not the first time you've described your life in the way of John Rambo's life.
Research from Brown, Cadero, Fields, and Marsh 2015 indicates this phenomena is actually rather common, with nearly half of participants reporting to borrow a story in entirety from a friend, and with 30% reporting to have believed the story to have been their own at the time of retelling it. 27.1% reported being unsure of the memory's origin. More than half, moreover, of participants said that they had gotten into arguments with others regarding whether an incident had occurred to themselves or to someone else. If it's not already overwhelmingly clear, friends, even the average person whose brain is unaffected by the effects of something like PTSD has fairly easily influenceable memories that are highly susceptible to error, alteration, or even complete fabrication, particularly upon prompts. The implantation of memories can occur from errors outside of this type of mere exposure, including, again, mere suggestion. Dr. Elizabeth Loftus, who is arguably the leading scholar on the concept of false memories, has conducted extensive research on this field. And given that Dr. Loftus received her doctoral degree from Stanford, where Dr. Ford also taught, if for no other reason than the fact that, again, she is the leading scholar in this field, is another reason why I'm a little bit skeptical here regarding Dr. Ford apparently not knowing anything about how memories are falsely implanted. Regardless, but without making any more speculation, let's look at the work of Dr. Loftus. In an initial informal test, a 14-year-old boy, Chris, was asked to recall 5 events that had happened to him as a young child. 3 of them were accurate, and 1 of them had been fabricated. He was given a short prompt about each event, and asked to write about them. The false event was a story about him being lost in a toy store when he was 5. Over the course of 5 days, Chris was asked to write down anything he could remember about these prompted memories. And while at first he had no recollection of the toy story, by the 5th day, he not only recalled it in detail, he had added new information to the story. A few weeks later, when interviewed about that memory, Chris now recalled everything from the flannel shirt of the old man who found him and brought him back to his mother's scolding words of scorn, to the intense feelings of fear and shame that he had associated with the event. When he was told that one of these memories was false, he chose one of his actual memories over the Toy Story narrative as the fabricated one. A follow-up study of 21 women and 3 men whose relatives were asked to describe the events of the participants' childhoods to researchers were similarly presented short descriptions of these events, in addition to an event that had been invented. Of these participants, 29% of subjects recalled some form of the false story, either fully or partially, when asked to write about it. When interviewed further, only 25% recalled the false story. However, over time, those that did recall the false narrative viewed it as more clear the second time they were interviewed. When told one of the stories was false, 20% of participants believed that one of their actual true-life stories was the fabricated one over the false one. Further, in a similar study involving real childhood events collected from participants' parents and invented events, Hyman, Husband, and Billings 1995 examined this effect of repeated interviewing regarding false memories and identified a linear relationship between the number of interviews and false memory recall. In the initial study, while no participants remembered a false memory during their first interview, by the second measure, 4 of the 20 participants reported recalling this fabricated memory. In a follow-up experiment of 51 adults, once again, the first interview forwarded no false recollections, but but by the second interview, 9 people reported memories of the false event, and by the third interview, that increased to 13, that is 25% of the sample recalling a false memory. We can see this not only in self-report and inaccuracy, but in the actual structure of the brain. Slotnick and Schachter, 2004, used fMRI to note activation in portions of the brain when participants recalled accurate versus false memories. After seeing a series of images and then being asked to remember them, participants saw a second set of images, some old, some new, and some similar to the ones they'd seen before. While various different areas of the brain were more or less active during the recollection of either false or accurate memories, both false and true forwarded similar activity in the early and late centers of visual processing, and the researchers suggest that due to this, the conscious mind is often incapable of differentiating between false and true memories. Interestingly as well, the researchers found that there was greater hippocampal activity associated with true memories over false ones. Again, the hippocampus being the damaged region in those who suffer from PTSD. We can start to see now, however, that one does not need to have dysfunction in the HPA axis to not only form false memories, but to perceive them as accurate. This is in part because human memory in general is not very accurate, hence why, while witness accounts are not only important but often crucial to criminal investigations, they really pale in comparison to the value of hard empirical evidence. In fact, even people with otherwise above average recollection are susceptible to false memory. Pathos et al. 2013 tested individuals who had been rated as possessing highly superior autobiographical memory, or HSAM, and asked them if they remembered having seen video footage of United 93 crashing on 9/11. That footage does not exist, and it turned out that they were only slightly less likely, 20% versus 29%, to report falsely having seen this non-existent video as those without HSAM. This means not only is the average person highly susceptible to memory distortions and false recollections, but even people with extremely precise, specific skill in recollection are susceptible to these same effects, and can be influenced relatively easily through misleading questions or prompts. Let's take, for example, the Netflix documentary series Making a Murderer, which describes the case of Stephen Avery, a man accused of murder who was jailed in large part due to a confession from his nephew, Brendan Dacy, which Brendan recanted years later. The at the time 16-year-old was repeatedly questioned by detectives. Brendan claimed he admitted to the crime because he guessed he had done it. With a lack of physical evidence, Brendan's testimony was critical to the conviction of Stephen Avery, and the documentary series spurred public interest in the idea of false confessions. Simply put, as we've seen, memories can be invented, and we often cannot differentiate them from reality. Physically, within our brains, we can't differentiate them. Particularly for those repeatedly interviewed, questioned, and forced to describe an event, be it by police, therapists, lawyers, or even the Senate. This seems to be consistently the case. The more someone is asked about a false memory, the more they are likely to believe it to be accurate, and the greater clarity to which they begin to describe it, as research confirms. Shaw and McClure in 1996 staged an altercation regarding a grade between a student and the professor, and then the students within the classroom were asked a series of questions about the event over time, either 20 minutes later, then a week later, and then up to 4 weeks later, and found that while accuracy in recounting the events remained mostly static, confidence in one's accuracy of the account increased over time the more they were questioned. That is, the more times a question was asked, the more confident participants were in their response, regardless of their actual accuracy. In people with memory malfunctions in general, this is surely only compounded. But the population at large is susceptible not just to inventing false memory, but to simply forget more and more over time in what's called the forgetting curve. The forgetting curve is a long-established phenomena dating back to Hermann Ebbinghaus's research in 1885, finding that his own memory degraded up to 50% within an hour and 60% within a day, and then continued to deteriorate over time. Much more recently, and scientifically valid, Newman and Loftus, 2012, described the current state of memory research as being still more or less consistent with the findings of the various inaccuracies of human recollection that Ebbinghaus raised. For example, I'm sure many of you have heard of the Mandela effect, wherein people report remembering that Nelson Mandela died in prison in the 1980s rather than a free man in 2013. Mitt Romney once publicly recalled being present at the automotive Golden Jubilee of 1946, despite not being born until a year later.
Of the 50th celebration of the automobile in Detroit, they painted the Woodward Avenue with gold paint. My memory's a little foggy here, so but yeah, I was probably 4 or something like that. But and had the cars go down Woodward Avenue. I know they still have the parade of cars every year.
It is that we often feel very assured of the accuracy of our memories despite them being completely fabricated, or more accurately, likely a combination of real-world events and experiences, imagination, and a myriad of all of the other events that have occurred both before and after within our lifetimes that simply become muddled in our web of cognitions and reflections. Using simple logic here, what's more likely? That a portion of us were transported into an alternate reality where Nelson Mandela didn't die in the 80s, and into an Earth which is parallel, and these parallel differences manifest with the variation in spelling of a children's book series? Or rather that collectively we as a species just do not possess very accurate memories? I would bet on the latter, and the data seem to support it. Further, while Newman and Lotfus note that we tend to remember the past in a more positive manner than necessarily reflected in reality. For example, many people believe they've received straight A's in school simply because being a model student is a desirable memory. The opposite may also be so for depressed people, who may instead ruminate on the past in a more negative light than it was in actuality. Dr. Ford also reports experiencing depression and anxiety. In their review of the research on eyewitness identification, McGrath and Turvey, 2014, similarly note the potential effect of stress and anxiety on recall, stating that the best way to formulate the effect of stress on memory is as follows. Stress will likely affect memory, but the effect may not be predictable, in that stress can make certain details more precise, while it also makes others more vague. But again, this is in the case of memories that do not necessarily result in long-term HPA axis dysfunction. So, we have been over a wealth of research indicating the malleability, frailty, and fragility of memory. But despite all this, according to Dr. Ford's account, she recalls Brett Kavanaugh's face with 100% certainty, as sure as she is able to recognize Dianne Feinstein in front of her in 2018. Is that possible? Perhaps, but it's unlikely as the data don't really support that. Magrea and Burton, 2009, tested subjects' ability to identify unfamiliar faces using actors in still video. Participants were only able to identify photos of the faces of actors both live and in video about 70% of the time immediately after their exposure, within 30 seconds. Even when given a series of photographs and asked to match the live actor sitting in front of them to a photo they had, participants were only accurate 85% of the time in choosing the matching photograph. That is, we are not very good at identifying faces, and this is particularly true of interracial identification, but that's not necessarily of particular import here. In even non-stressful circumstances, we are bad at recognizing faces. And given that by Dr. Ford's own admission, she was not part of the same social circles as Kavanaugh, it is unlikely she was overwhelmingly familiar with his face at the time at which this potentially occurred, and she probably became a little bit more familiar with it when he became a topic of major media attention. In summation, after having seen a plethora of data that illustrate not only the fallibility of human memory in general, but particularly the fallibility of memory and recollection in individuals who have been the victims of extreme trauma, leading to neurobiological problems in cognitive, emotional, and memory processing both long and short term, I would like to propose hereby an alternative theory that I think well explains what may have happened to Dr. Ford at some time during the early to mid-1980s. Well, yes, it is very possible her memories are entirely invented, just as it is possible that they were implanted via media exposure, suggestion, countertransference from a therapist, or any other combination of the various phenomena that I have described in this video. Let us here assume that she is telling the truth to the best of her ability, and the memory has a basis in reality. Ed Whelan, one of the men supposedly at the party Dr. Ford described, who along with all of the other supposed eyewitnesses claims no recollection of said event, in a Twitter thread posted the layout of a house that very much resembles and matches the description provided by Dr. Ford, which was in a short walk of the Columbia Country Club that she said she swam at that day. This home belonged to the parents of Christopher Garrett at the time in question, a friend and teammate of Kavanaugh, who was also friends with Mike Judge. A side-by-side comparison of their yearbook photos illustrates that Kavanaugh and Garrett were rather similar in appearance, and Dr. Ford herself has admitted that she went out with Garrett for a period of time in high school. I'm not saying that Christopher Garrett assaulted Dr. Ford, to be clear. I'm saying that Ed Whelan provides us with a very reasonable alternative to a traumatic event that likely did occur in Dr. Ford's life. Given the malleability of memory and the inaccuracy of recollections of specifics, particularly in those with hippocampal atrophy, and the tendency for all of us to combine our imagination with reality and multiple memories into one single event as a product of the fragility of our capacity for accurate recollection, at this point almost anything could be possible. But it certainly seems plausible, if not likely then, that this traumatic memory of a sexual assault involved a boy Dr. Ford admits to have arguably been sexually involved with at a house within walking distance of her country club, who happens to look a bit like Kavanaugh. That's certainly possible. Although admittedly, anything is possible given the complete unreliable nature of human memory. But in assumption of innocence and good intent on all parties, why would all of the other supposed witnesses have no recollection of this event beyond Dr. Ford? The problem is that there is no way to investigate this because it is based entirely on very vague recollections, even if Dr. Ford had no ulterior motive. And don't let the media and Democrats claim that she had nothing to gain fool you. As her GoFundMe of over $500,000 in donations continues to skyrocket, she will undoubtedly receive, in addition, countless paid interviews, book deals, and so on, as the brave woman who dared to come forward with this accusation. Despite no empirical evidence, without a single concrete description upon which is actionable, I am still willing to base this analysis on the presumption of innocence, something no one on the left appears to be willing to do when it comes to Brett Kavanaugh. No, my issue with Dr. Ford is that she is Dr. Ford. Were she just Mrs. Ford, I could understand some, or maybe all of this, but she's not. She has a PhD in psychology, and particularly she received a MS from Stanford University, where she also began teaching in 1988 in the psychology department, where leading scholar in false memories, Dr. Lotfus, received her own PhD in 1970. Not only would Dr. Ford's seemingly misunderstanding regarding memory be suspect to me based on her descriptions of neurobiology during the hearing, knowing that she comes from a psychiatric and psychological background, but knowing she comes from the same academic pedigree as Dr. Lotfus, that raises even greater suspicion. I can understand ignorance. I cannot, however, tolerate lying either directly or through obfuscation, and certainly not through the use of psychobabble for the purpose of seeming credible and intellectual despite saying essentially nonsense that is in actuality contradictory to the extant data. That I cannot abide, hence this extensive review of the literature. Do I personally believe that Dr. Ford was sexually assaulted? At this point, that's the only question there can be regarding this case. It has to be opinion, because there is no and never will be any evidence. So here is my opinion. I think it is very possible, yes. Many people, myself included, have noted her use of a high-pitched vocal fry. Research from Anderson, Klofstad, Mayview, and Venkatachalam, 2014, notes that women who use this type of speech are often perceived of as less educated and competent. Similarly, although lacking the quantitative analysis I would like, at least as far as I'm aware, Dr. Drew Pinsky and other therapists have often noticed that high-pitched baby voices in women are an indicator of sexual assault during childhood.
We're going to speak now to Mary, who's got a question. I believe she's calling from Utah. Mary, what's going on?
Hi, I've got a stepson that's just been taken from his mother, and we're working on getting custody. And
Mary,
I just wasn't...
Mary, how old are you?
24.
You're a trauma survivor?
Am I a what?
A trauma survivor? Were you, like, abused as a young child?
Yeah.
Because you sound 4, and that's often a sign to me that people were particularly sexually abused around that very age. Is that what happened to you?
Yeah,
How old were you?
I was 4.
Okay, there's still some developmental stuff, boy. I mean, my goodness. I hear 4-year-old when you talk, and it's
On one hand, the little girl voice provides support for the claim that Dr. Ford was assaulted as a young girl. On the other, Dr. Ford is likely as aware of these trends and perceptions, just as she is likely aware of the malleability and inaccuracy of human memory. And thus it is possible she actually intentionally adopted the high-pitched vocal fry to appear childish and incompetent to gain sympathy. Of course, that doesn't mix well when you include vaguely scientific jargon. So what do I think? I don't know. And frankly, I would surmise, based on everything we do know about memory, that Dr. Ford likely doesn't either. Perhaps at one point she did, but after all of the outside influence, the questioning, the media exposure, and so on, I would be highly suspect of the validity of any of her recollections at this point. And that's really not me being partisan. That's me trying to explain what I think has happened here. At this point in time, so far after the fact, and with so many potentially influencing factors, we cannot make serious decisions based on flawed recollections, because all of our recollections are flawed. That is the nature of human memory. If you have enjoyed this video, please be sure to like and subscribe. I have linked 2 books down below that you may be interested in if you wish to read more about some of these subjects, as well as always, an extensive reference list. I'm Aidan Paladin, Old Ton of Old.